I reached for my wife's hand across the white linen table. Just a small gesture. Nothing dramatic. Just a way to anchor myself in a room full of her colleagues. The music hummed soft in the background. Glasses clinked, and laughter rose in polished waves. My fingers brushed hers, seeking connection, and she yanked them back as if my touch carried shame. Her breath burned against my ear as she leaned closer, her voice sharp enough to cut. Don't let them think we're a couple. The words didn't just sting. They stripped me bare. A few nearby heads turned. Some smirked, others exchanged quick glances before pretending not to notice. I could feel the laughter even if no one dared to let it escape. My face burned as though every chandelier in that glittering hall had swung its spotlight onto me. I sat frozen for a moment, staring at the woman beside me, the woman I'd promised forever to. Her smile returned instantly, warm and effortless, as she turned back to the table. She leaned toward the man on her other side, laughing too loudly at his story, while I sat invisible, my humiliation dripping down like spilled wine, staining my shirt. Inside, my heart kicked against my ribs. Was I a stranger to the woman I built a home with? Was I really so unworthy of being seen as hers? My chest tightened, but I forced my lips into a polite curve, the kind of mask men wear when their pride is bleeding. I excused myself, my voice trembling though I disguised it as calm. She didn't even glance at me when I pushed back my chair. Her hand rested lightly on her wine glass, her eyes alive as though freed from a burden. I walked slowly past the tables, feeling the silence wrap around me, heavy, suffocating. The cold night air slapped me when I stepped outside. I drew it deep into my lungs, each breath sharper than the last. The stars above glittered like strangers watching me, distant, indifferent. My hands shook as I shoved them into my pockets, replaying the scene again and again. That wasn't the first sign of her detachment. It wasn't the first time she pulled away, but it was the loudest, the most public. I stood there on the marble, steps, my heart pounding, my pride shredded, realizing that in her eyes I wasn't a partner. I was a liability she wanted to hide. And for the first time, the thought took root like poison in my veins. Maybe she had already decided she was no longer my wife. We were once that couple people pointed at with admiration, the ones who looked inseparable. We met in college, sitting side by side in a lecture hall, and from the first time she smiled at me, I thought my life had been rewritten. She was vibrant, full of plans, the kind of woman who could command a room without even trying. I was quieter, steadier, the one who carried her books and listened when the world grew too heavy on her shoulders. When we got married, everyone said we were proof that love stories weren't just fairy tales. But with time, the cracks started to form. Hairline fractures that didn't seem dangerous at first. She became more careful about how she looked, more deliberate about how people saw her. At first I thought it was normal. Who doesn't want to look good? But soon it wasn't just about her. It was about me too. She started correcting me at restaurants if I mispronounced a wine, or shushing me when I laughed too loud. At home, if I reached for her, she would gently push my hand away with a practiced smile, saying she was tired or not in the mood. I told myself she was stressed, that she'd soften again, that the girl I fell in love with was still somewhere inside the woman who seemed to be slipping further away. Her obsession with social media grew like ivy crawling up the walls of our home. Every dinner was photographed, every moment edited, and filtered until it looked perfect for strangers scrolling through their phones. Online, we were the dream couple. In reality, I was often the punchline. At family dinners, she'd mock the way I dressed or how I wasn't ambitious enough, making little jokes that made others laugh at my expense. I forced a smile each time, my stomach knotting, telling myself it wasn't worth an argument. She'd come around, I believed. She had to. But when she pulled her hand away at that event, when she whispered those words like poison, "Don't let them think we're a couple," something inside me broke cleanly in two. It wasn't just a moment of embarrassment. It was confirmation of every quiet rejection, every dismissal, every sneer she'd tried to hide behind her charm. That single act became the symbol of what we had become, a marriage in name only, a hollow performance for the world. I stood outside that night with the cold air slicing through me and made a promise to myself. If I wasn't her husband in public, I wouldn't be her husband in private either. I began watching her more carefully after that night, as though pulling back the curtain on a play I had been blindly clapping for. She spent more and more evenings with friends or caught up in business meetings that seemed to stretch late into the night. When she came home, her phone was always in her hand, flipped face down on the counter, buzzing in secret. New passwords appeared without explanation, and if I so much as glanced toward her screen, her body tensed like I had crossed a forbidden line. I stopped reaching for her hand. I stopped leaning in for a hug when she came through the door. No, more late-night kisses or playful brushes of affection. At first I thought she'd notice, maybe even ask what was wrong, but she didn't. In fact, she seemed lighter, almost relieved, like my silence gave her space she had been quietly begging for. Instead of chasing her love, I turned inward. I began journaling, pouring out the truths I couldn't speak aloud. Each entry was a record of what I saw, what I felt, the patterns she thought I was too blind to catch. I stopped sleeping beside her, moving into the guest room. When I carried my pillow down the hall the first night, she didn't ask why. She didn't even look up. The man who once begged for her touch, for her attention, was fading. In his place was someone colder, quieter, detached. My heart still hurt, but it no longer reached out for her. It just beat, steady and heavy, inside, a chest that finally understood what it meant to be unwanted. And then came the discovery. One night when she left her laptop open on the kitchen counter, I saw a flash of words that froze me in place. A thread of emails, direct messages, conversations where she confessed to someone that she hated being seen with me, that she wished people didn't think we were together, that I was an embarrassment. My throat closed as I read those lines, each sentence confirming the truth I had tried so hard to ignore. She hadn't just pulled her hand away once in public. She had been pulling away from me for months, piece by piece, until I was nothing but a shadow she wished would disappear. It happened again, only this time the cut went deeper because I was ready for it, and she still didn't hesitate to swing the blade. She had invited me to one of her colleagues' dinner parties, a polished affair in a downtown loft, walls lined with abstract art, glasses of champagne carried around like props. I followed her in, quiet, supportive, hoping that maybe this time she'd remember I was her husband, not just some accessory she forgot to leave at home. But as introductions circled the room, I heard it with my own ears. Her laugh rang out, smooth and confident, as she extended her hand to someone new. "Oh, I'm single, just focusing on work these days." My stomach clenched so hard I thought I'd double over. Around the circle, smiles twitched, and one man glanced at me as if I were a stranger who had wandered in by mistake. Someone joked, "So you brought a +1 just for fun?" The group chuckled, and I forced a weak smile, my face burning. She didn't correct them, not once. She let me stand there, stripped of my title as her husband, reduced to a ghost hovering at her side. That was my breaking point, the moment I realized it wasn't accidental, it was deliberate. She never defended the marriage because, to her, the marriage no longer existed. From that night on, I started documenting. Not for revenge, not for some courtroom drama, but for myself, for clarity. I wrote down the conversations, the laughs, at my expense, the way she dimmed whenever I entered a room. I wanted to see it all written out, to remove the illusions I kept clinging to, and in that clarity I began to see her more clearly than ever. She wasn't just distant, she was addicted. Addicted to attention, to the thrill of being admired, to the validation that came from being seen as desirable. I was dead weight in her world, the dull anchor dragging behind her shine. She craved the sparkle of strangers' approval more than the steady warmth of loyalty. So I stopped arguing. What was the point? Every protest only made me look more pathetic in her eyes. Instead, I studied her with the patience of a man preparing for something larger. watching as she built her own downfall brick by brick. By the end of the night, she was leaning too close to a wealthy colleague, her laugh pitched just high enough to draw eyes. His hand lingered on her arm, and she didn't move it away. I didn't wait for the final act. I slipped out early, stepping into the night air without a word, already thinking of the next move I would make, one she'd never see coming. She didn't just reject my hand, she rejected my existence. The thought haunted me every time. I looked at her every time I replayed that moment when she flinched from my touch as though I carried shame in my fingertips. But the more I turned it over in my mind, the less it shattered me. Something inside me shifted. If she could erase me in public, then I could erase her in silence. I stopped wasting my energy begging for her affection and started turning it inward. The gym became my sanctuary. I threw myself into runs at dawn, lifting until my muscles burned, watching the man in the mirror change from a hollow shell into someone leaner, sharper, stronger. At work, I buried myself in projects, and for the first time in years, promotions and recognition found me without me chasing them. My bank account grew, my confidence steadied. Quietly, I built independence she didn't even notice. I opened new accounts in my name only, redirected deposits, cut away the shared credit lines like trimming rotting branches from a tree. Every bill that tied me to her was slowly unraveled, every rope of financial dependence cut. To her, it looked like I was simply occupied with work, less bothersome, easier to ignore. In truth, I was withdrawing piece by piece, reclaiming myself. Without confrontation, friends began to notice before she did. They commented on how I looked calmer, how my eyes carried a new steadiness, how I no longer seemed to shrink in my own skin. They asked if I was okay, and for the first time in a long while, I could answer honestly, I will be. She, of course, was too busy feeding on the attention of others to notice the storm beneath the still water. Nights out, constant scrolling through her phone, laughter in corners I wasn't invited to. She thought she was free. What she didn't realize was that I had stopped being her cage long ago. One evening, when she slipped into bed without so much as a glance at me, I sat at the kitchen table with a pen in my hand and papers spread before me, divorce papers. I read through every line slowly, my pulse steady. I could have signed them then, ended it quietly, but I didn't. Not yet. Instead, I slid them into a folder and tucked them away, because leaving her silently wasn't enough. No, she had made our unraveling a performance, and when the curtain fell, I intended to make sure the stage was hers, not mine. Her collapse didn't come all at once. It began like a hairline crack in glass, barely visible at first, but spreading wider with every passing week. The image she had polished so carefully, the perfect wife, the social darling, the magnetic colleague, started to fracture under the weight of her own choices. Her colleagues whispered when they thought she couldn't hear. They noticed the way she dismissed me in public, the way she laughed too loud at another man's jokes while leaving me to stand alone. Her friends exchanged looks at dinners, no longer dazzled by her charm, quietly questioning why a woman so obsessed with appearances seemed to delight in tearing down the man beside her. And then the rumors began. Little murmurs, half-truths laced with too much detail to ignore. That she was spending late nights with a colleague, that lines between friendship and something more were blurring. She tried to deny it with her usual bright smile, but once whispers start, they rarely stop. I never lifted a finger to expose her. I didn't need to. Her own hunger for validation was enough to light the fire that burned her stage to the ground. I simply watched, quiet and steady, while the cracks widened. She began to notice me again, not with affection but with unease. My distance unsettled her. I no longer begged for her attention, no longer reached for her hand, no longer asked where she'd been or who she was with. My silence frightened her more than my words ever could. One night, her voice broke through the tension as she stood in the kitchen, arms crossed like a shield. "Why aren't you trying anymore?" she asked, almost pleading, as though my lack of pursuit was the real betrayal. I looked at her evenly, my voice calm, almost detached. "You told me not to let them think we're a couple." I listened. The color drained from her face. For once, she had no clever retort, no smile to mask the sting, and so the roles reversed. She, the one who once fed on my desperation, now lingered in doorways, hovering near me, searching for scraps of the attention she had so carelessly thrown away. And one night, long past midnight, I heard her footsteps pause at the guest room door. She came in quietly, eyes wet, voice trembling as she whispered my name. But I didn't move. I didn't reach for her. I didn't give her the comfort she had abandoned long ago. She was realizing she was losing grip on the man she once thought she could humiliate into silence. And now, I wasn't hers to wound anymore. The final reckoning came not in a fight, not in some private explosion, but in the quiet elegance of another gathering. It was a family wedding this time, the kind of event where everyone dressed their best and pretended old wounds didn't exist. She slipped her arm through mine as we walked in, her smile polished, her voice sweetened with effort. I could feel her trying to reattach the mask, to make it seem as though we were the perfect couple again. At the reception, she leaned against me, touched my arm, even laughed in my direction as though the months of silence and dismissal had never happened. To the crowd, it must have looked affectionate. To me, it felt like theater. I didn't push her away, but I didn't return it either. I simply stood there smiling politely, as if playing the role she once forced me into. The moment arrived when someone, an uncle, curious and careless, asked how long we had been married now, and whether we were thinking of renewing our vows. The air around the table seemed to pause, forks halting midair, eyes shifting toward us. She opened her mouth, ready with some rehearsed answer, but I spoke first. "We're not really a couple anymore," I said, my tone calm, almost conversational. She made sure of that. The silence that followed was sharper than any scream. Gasps, murmurs, the sound of whispers slipping across linen. I didn't need to raise my voice. I didn't need to accuse her of anything. The truth alone was enough to tilt the ground beneath her. I saw it in her face, the crack in her composure, the sudden collapse of the image she had worked so hard to polish. For once, she was the one exposed, the one stripped bare under the weight of judgment. The shame she had weaponized against me now turned back on her, multiplied by the eyes of family and strangers alike. I didn't gloat. I didn't yell. I simply held my truth like armor and let it shield me. She stumbled through the rest of the evening, her laughter forced, her eyes darting nervously while I remained steady, my glass in hand, untouched by the storm she created. The next morning, as sunlight poured into the quiet of our kitchen, I left the envelope on the table. Divorce papers, signed, sealed, undeniable. The performance was over. The stage was hers now, and I was no longer part of the act. She wanted the world to see us as strangers. Now we are. Those words circled in my head as I packed the last of my things into a small apartment with sunlit windows and silence that belonged only to me. The quiet no longer felt like punishment. It felt like freedom. Mornings began with coffee I brewed. For myself, runs through the city that cleared the fog from my chest, and hours at the gym where each drop of sweat carved out a stronger version of me. At work, opportunities opened. I wasn't weighed down anymore, and people noticed the difference. I learned to enjoy my own company, to savor the stillness she once filled with sharp words and hollow laughter. I read more, cooked my own meals, discovered that solitude could be a gift instead of a wound. Friends who had once pitied me now looked at me with respect, admiring the way I carried myself with calmness instead of chaos. Meanwhile, her life began to unravel. The colleagues who once flattered her kept their distance, uneasy with the whispers that followed her into rooms. The friends who cheered at her performances grew tired of the cracks in her act, and one by one they stopped showing up. The reputation she had polished so obsessively dulled and crumbled until nothing remained but loneliness. She had built her empire on appearances, and appearances abandoned her. I never gloated, never sought revenge in fire or fury. I didn't need to. My peace was its own form of justice. And as I sat one evening in my new apartment, watching the city lights blink against the dark, I understood the truth. The night she refused to hold my hand was the night I stopped carrying her.